Okay, fourth and last video here for the material for exam 2 in contending perspectives. Let me erase all this. I told you I was going to go into a little bit more detail on, yes, on question 84. Where are you, dog? I don't know where he is. All right. And it's about modern monetary theory. Ooh, I gotta tell you this. So I was walking the dog last night to wear him out so he would sleep well. And we got about halfway around the block, and all of a sudden he just froze and started staring into the shadows around a house. And I thought, well, all right, whatever. So I dragged him a little further, and he did it again. And then all of a sudden he wouldn't go any further. So I stood there with the leash slack, and he just turned and headed for home. And all the way home, he's like looking back and forth the whole time, checking out the shadows. I've seen way too many horror movies to ignore a warning like that. So we went straight home after that. But he never stopped to smell anything, to dig at anything like that. He clearly sensed something, probably a vampire or a werewolf that frightened him. And so we got the heck out of there. Now, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Modern monetary theory, study question number 84. And as I said, I wanted to talk about it not only because it's a study question, but because it's been in the news a lot here lately, and controversially so. And let me build it up here a little slowly, right? First thing is that if you think about the way the federal government spending works, everyone goes on about how horrible the national debt is, right? That, oh my gosh, the government spending in terrible deficits. Clinton was a great guy. Trump is a terrible guy because Clinton balanced the budget and Trump is running up the debt, whatever. All right, check this out. Here is Pat, and here is Chris. All right. Let's say over the course of the year, Pat buys $100 worth of stuff from Chris, and Chris buys $150 worth of stuff from Pat. All right. So at the end of the year, let's write this in red and green. At the end of the year, Chris has a $50 deficit. And, Pat has a $50 surplus. All right? So, because there must be an offsetting surplus to every deficit and an offsetting deficit to every surplus. I ask classes this every semester. I ask, civic groups when I give talks and stuff, and they always get the answer right. If you add up every trade balance on the planet, if you add up every trade surplus and every trade deficit on the planet, of course counting the surpluses as a positive number and the deficits as a negative number, what do you get? And everyone always says, quite correctly, 0. They have to add to 0. Because if the U.S. has a surplus to, I don't know who we have a surplus to, well, deficit. If the U.S. has a deficit to China, then China has a surplus to us, and by the exact same amount. So, let's say over the course of the year, Chris had purchased $150 worth of stuff from Pat, and Pat bought $100 worth of stuff from Chris, leaving Chris with a deficit of 50 and Pat with a surplus of 50. Who would you rather be? When I ask this question, people often say, I'd rather be Pat than Chris. Oh my God, that's who you are. Government, private sector. If the government has a budget deficit, somebody must have a budget surplus, all right? It has to be offsetting. When the government spends more than it taxes, then these people paid less in taxes than they received in income, either because they're federal employees or because they received a grant or whatever reason. But if the government is spending, what color have I not used? Oh, horned frog purple. If the government is spending this much, but only collecting this much in taxes, then the private sector has a surplus. And guess what happened? At the end of the Clinton years, when this number became bigger than this number, private sector debt skyrocketed, all right? For an additional reason too. I'm only going to mention it here. In intermediate macro, we went into it in some detail, but I'm just going to mention it here. Because not only did these people pay more in taxes than they got back in government spending from the public sector. So they were in debt to the government. They paid more to the government than the government paid to them, but they also paid more to the rest of the world because there was also a trade deficit here. But I'm not going to mention that again because it makes it more complicated than we need to get in contending perspectives. So, A, the government's deficit is your surplus. And so, well, it's all going to China. No, it's not. We'll get to that in a minute. All right. Next thing. Let's say that, say for example, after the financial crisis, that we're doing this to boost the economy, so we're trying to create extra employment. Yeah, but surely we can't do this forever. Let's say we need to have these government deficits in order to stimulate the economy sufficiently to maintain full employment. It's ridiculous to have the kind of productivity that we have and have people have to go without because there are insufficient employment opportunities. So we need the government to generate these extra funds in the private sector to boost employment. It goes into a little bit more detail in the book, and I don't want to go into a lot more of it right here because I'm wanting to focus on a different issue. So we need the government, on average, to be spending more than it is taking up in taxes, all right? But one may say, well, but they can't do that forever because as they accumulate, how about them vols? As they accumulate debt over time, which is the accumulation of all the previous deficits minus any of the surpluses, surely there comes a point when they have to default. And here, gosh, I wish I had my list of all the quotes that I can show you from federal government officials, from scholars, from private sector investors who say it is impossible for the United States of America to default on debt in its own currency. It cannot happen, all right? We could choose to default. That would be like a hungry person in a food warehouse saying, I'm not going to eat. But there's no reason to do that, all right? That the federal government's debt is entirely in dollars. What was Greek debt in? In euros. They can't print euros. When Mexico had a financial crisis in 1994 and defaulted on debt, what was that debt in? Not pesos. It was in dollars. And on and on. If the debt is in your own currency, as Paul Volcker, was it Greenspan? Crap. Greenspan testified in Congress, and you can find the video very easily on YouTube. Well, I think it was Paul Ryan was asking him, yeah, but at some point we got to pay off the debt, right? And Greenspan said, well, actually no. The U.S. never could default on debt in its own currency. Now, there can be other consequences. As we found in World War II, when we continued to spend with these huge deficits, when we were already at full employment, it causes inflation, all right? Because there was such demand for goods and services couldn't keep up. But under other circumstances, when we're not in full employment, no, it's not inflationary. And I have a whole class on what it does to the exchange rate. It doesn't do anything directly whatsoever. But again, that's international monetary economics, which I teach in the fall. Hopefully live and not like this again. Now, let's see here. Okay, so I told you all that. All right, so our real constraints in the economy, this is what's being argued by this modern monetary theory, has to do with resources, okay? It doesn't have to do with money. Money grows on trees. It really does. Now, state and local governments don't have unconstrained budgets, but the federal government does. And so you notice we never ask, well, gosh, how much is that war going to cost us? We just fight the war because it turns out that as long as we have the resources, we can come up with the money. The resources are always the constraint, never the money. All right, so this goes back to study question 84. I'm going to say this rather quickly. Of course, you can stop it, back up, and then write it down. I don't know. Supporters of modern monetary theory argue that the standard view of government budgeting is fundamentally flawed. Explain their distinction between wealth and money. Period. Because of this distinction, they say the true cost of leaving labor idle is what? Wealth is a function of an economy's ability to produce goods and services, not the volume of cash it has accumulated. Money is simply a computer entry, and it can be created at will. The true cost that is associated with allowing labor to remain idle, I wrote this myself. I should be able to read it. The true cost is that associated with allowing labor to remain idle and rob us of the output that we would have created. So, anyway, a lot more to it than that. Take intermediate macro, and I'll explain it to you there. Otherwise, 10-minute video. That's it. That's it for exam 2. So let's see. I'll send you further email updates. I mentioned something about this Zoom.com thing where you can do a live. So we could do this live where if you had any questions about the things I've gone over. I wanted to give you the lectures on YouTube so you'd have the ability to watch these at your convenience. Otherwise, I guess that's it. All right. So we'll be in touch.